So then, okay, so there's another element to that too, which is, okay, the question might be, to what degree are we required to tolerate a certain amount of ineradicable suffering? Because that's the argument you're basically making. You're saying, look, we can equalize and we can provide opportunity. And we've hit the point of diminishing returns. Now, not everywhere, obviously, and not in every sector, but you could make the case that we've hit the point of diminishing returns. And still, there's a tremendous amount of inequality and suffering. It's like, and we don't find that acceptable. It's yes, yeah, but the problem is the more you push to remove that last bit of ineradicable suffering, the more likely you are to produce a worse kickback in another place. And it's not an easy thing to contend with.
And the fact is that we're going to be discussing this whether or not NBC, CBS, or ABC likes it. And they can't do anything about shutting this conversation down until YouTube or Twitter, really decides to get heavy-handed and give us the boot. And so fundamentally, we don't sound like what we're supposed to sound. Does this sound like an alt-right conversation? Does it sound hyper-conservative? No. It's a very difficult picture, and the key problem is that the only place it's being explored is in these super luxurious long-form interviews. I have no idea how people tune in. Like when we went to Tempe, people were tracking these conversations at a level that we're not tracking these conversations.
I know.
Because the hunger,
they care. They actually care
and
about
they
the
know they know that the cognitive Lego they've been handed is not capable of getting in surgically.
Look what's happening at Harvard. This is such an interesting example about the entire landscape. It's like the upshot. It looks like the upshot of the policies designed to produce something approximating equity, or at least equality of opportunity. The gerrymandering of the admissions process has halved the number of Asians at Harvard. And then Harvard's, of course, denying that strenuously. And they say, well, our selection method is too esoteric to be captured properly by the statistics. It's like, oh, that's really how you're going to defend yourself, is it?
Right, there's nowhere.
The Harvard math department, I think, had one female mathematician. I think it doesn't have a senior female mathematician now. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that the university is trying to put pressure. Hey, what's wrong with you guys? Get with the program.
Well, the National Science Foundation is trying to do that across the entire STEM disciplines now, and they're really going to muck up math by playing around with this. Because the data show, it's quite interesting, the data show that if you look at junior high, there's some dispute about this. There still might be evidence that there's a small percentage of small advantage to men at the highest levels of mathematical ability, but I'll leave that aside for now. The more general data show that there's plenty of gifted women and there's plenty of gifted girls, there's plenty of gifted boys. But the gifted boys are gifted in math and not verbally, whereas the gifted girls in math are gifted verbally too. And so one of the consequences is that because math is a very specialized subdiscipline,
their opportunity costs are higher.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The girls decide not to pursue math.
And the thing is that math perfectly well tolerates the females that it understands their work and can't live without. I mean, if I think about Emmy Noether or Karen Uhlenbeck or Dusa McDuff, there's a huge number of women who are very well integrated in physics, people like Lisa Randall. I don't even think about there being women mathematicians or women physicists. It's just like that result, this paper.
Right.
And the idea.
So thank God for that.
Right. But the point that I'm trying to get at here is that there are still structural barriers, and there's probably something that isn't a structural barrier, like, for example, the incentive structures. And if the pay keeps going down, my guess is that you'll get more females in, which is a totally perverse effect that's been studied, that you start going into the female and minority sectors when men feel that they have higher opportunity costs based on their level of aggression, that they can go into management consulting or Wall Street.
Right.
So there's all
that's
of these
a major complication.
But the key question is, we need to be able to have the real conversation somewhere. And it needs to not.
Well, we also need to have a conversation about why it might be advantageous to be paid less. One of the reasons it's advantageous to be paid less is the demands are less on you. So if you have other things that you want to do with your life, then taking a job that pays less. This happens in law all the time, all the time. I worked as a consultant for legal companies, for law firms for 10 years with lots of high-end women. And I saw the same thing happen all the time. And the law firms know this right to the core. And all the women in the law firms know it too. Almost all the women bail out of the high-end positions in law in their early 30s. Well, why? Well, it's partly because if they're making, say they're making $350,000 to $500,000 a year, they're charging $1,000 an hour. Well, the workload is absolutely insane. you better be billing 2,300 hours a year, right, if you're going to stay in that position. And you're on call all the time, and you're basically working 16-hour days. So maybe what you want to do instead is find a 9-to-5 job that pays half as much, but you get to have a life.
It's more psychotic inside the universities. And here's what nobody really wants to discuss. The great danger, according to many of my colleagues in well-placed in high-level science departments, is they say the following: we don't know which females are going to discover the pleasures of family after we've invested in them. And so the idea is that sometime in their mid-30s, some number of women, they think, discover, oh my God, I've never been so fulfilled as when I've had my child. And some women say, I can't wait to get back to the lab, right? And these are two different reactions. So by pushing the point of commitment farther and farther towards middle age, what you're doing is that you're actually screening out the fact that you don't know which people you're going to invest in and are going to decide that they have something more interesting to do in their life in terms of kin work, or that compel them more, because kin work also has to do with aging parents, right? Now, the fact is that women are more conscientious with respect to child rearing and with aging parents generically than men. And so part of the game...
Probably a function of being agreeable.
Probably a function of fitness, where
you know,
the idea is that uncertain paternity and certain maternity means that in a highly K-selected species, females are going to be ever more focused on kin in this way.
Maybe that's the reason that the differences in agreeableness evolved.
I'm not.
I've never thought about that. That could be. I never thought about that as a
likely explanation. Right. But the issue that fundamentally we would defer tenure as a means of screening out females who are going to invest in fertility. Now, it's very interesting. If you look at feminist scientists in the 50s, you have women who had 4 kids, and they spent a life in science. And very often you poke and prod at these things. Well, there was an army of servants because there was wealth in the family, very often. And so my claim is, if you really want to do something profound for women in technical subjects, you should pay them more, and you should get them help in the house.
It didn't work in law.
Well, this is the issue, because to some extent it's a question of fulfillment.
Because most of the women that I worked with, they all had nannies. They outsourced all their domestic duties. That was covered, man, and that was part of the bargain.
Well, let me tell you,
but it still didn't
you know
stop
a more successful group of people than I do, because very often...
Well, they had the money for it.
Well, when 2 people can't get jobs together in contiguous states, it's like, oh, I've got a job in Oklahoma and he's got a job in Alabama, and we try to see each other 2 weekends a month. Things have gone wildly off the rails. But the key point is that employers are playing games trying to figure out this change in the life cycle, where some women are very, very happy doing kick-ass work throughout their life. Maybe they can figure out how to do it all. Some of them can, some of them can't.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to do it all.
It's pretty hard to do it all. It helps if you have money.
It does.
It does help. But we are not owning up to what are these games and what are these differences, and where should we be subsidizing?
We're also not owning up to the fact that the gender difference in pay isn't a gender difference, it's a mother difference. Because women take the big hit in their salaries when they decide to have kids. So it isn't women.
Just that?
No, it's not just that, but and nothing is, hardly anything is ever just one thing.
Right. But the whole thing about equal pay for equal work and 75 cents on the dollar, right, is that when you poke and prod at that, there is an unfairness and there is a misrepresentation. And the point is, we're not comfortable having the open conversation about, do we want to subsidize people based on this difference? Now, my wife has a really interesting point, and she said, look, I believe in the Fisherian equivalence between male and female as strategies, where males tend to be the high risk, high return, moderate risk, moderate return. And there was a time when wars were common and men got called up and women didn't have as high end prospects and everybody was working the fields or washing clothes at home. And then her point, it's really interesting, is knowledge work became wildly more fulfilling very quickly, and the number of wars, and this is my addendum to it, has gone down. And so suddenly it's much better to be male in her way of thinking than it is female in a way that was never true before. And so that there is a novelty effect, which is that knowledge work is outpacing the fulfillment of child rearing at some level, because the problems that you can solve if you're well placed to do so have increased in number, and they're very, very fulfilling.
And they're also disproportionately lucrative, at least in some situations.
And they're disproportionately lucrative. And so I do think that one of the things we have to do, look at the Vietnam War Memorial, and I think there are like 8 female names on it. And it's just, George, Tom, Chad, Right. So there is this forgetting of the fact that maleness has this huge downside.
Which is the high risk part of the high risk, high return strategy.
And your point about interest in things over people. At my local pinball arcade in San Francisco, which, I take my son there. There's a women's room, and there are clearly pinball machines that are intended to get a female audience, but it's like 20-to-1 males to females, because it's this kind of robotic activity where you're just putting money into a machine and you're watching a ball and some flashing lights. I find it quite entertaining. But I look at myself and I think,
you're saying chicks
man, I'm out of my mind.
Well,